questions or criticisms about the ontological argument? On the, just to recap, so if you say the greatest conceivable being exists only in your mind, you're saying the greatest conceivable being isn't really the greatest conceivable being, which is a contradiction. You're asserting A, you're saying A is not A. And that's a contradiction. And so since a contradiction can't be true, atheism can't be true, therefore theism must be true. God has to exist. And if you look at this logically, in indirect proof, assume God doesn't exist, not G. Suppose G stands for God exists. So if you assume not G, God doesn't exist, then you're saying, well, okay, well, if God doesn't exist, then the greatest concealed being is not the greatest concealed being. So, and if you just kind of work through this logically, if not G, then the greatest concealed being is not the greatest concealed being. So if not G, then A is not A, right? So and then you get, so therefore it turns out that that's false. So you can't, anything that implies something that's false has to be false itself. If I say, let me example. If I don't know, if Governor Kitzhaber doesn't go to jail, then I'll be a monkey's uncle or something, right? But it turns out if I'm obviously not a monkey's uncle, then I'm asserting that Kitzhaber has to go to jail. So this idea that if it's not the case that God doesn't exist, let's see, is this right?
Entire forms of monkeys.
Yeah. Let's see if I have this. I was trying to spell this out in symbolic form. I think I might have a typo here. So you assume that God doesn't exist. And then if God doesn't exist, it follows that the greatest concealable being isn't the greatest concealable being. Well, that's a contradiction. So by assuming God doesn't exist, you end up in a contradiction. Therefore, it's not the case that God doesn't exist, or in other words, God does exist. Okay, yeah, so there's not a typo there. Good. So that's sort of the logical form of the argument. That's not, I won't ask something like this on the test. So let's talk about objections to it. Maybe I'll just hit this here. Ganillo's objection. So Anselm wrote these couple books, and his fellow monk Ganillo writes this book, Reply on Behalf of the Fool. So the fool is the guy that says there is no God. It's a quote from one of the Psalms. It says, the fool has said in his heart there is no God. And this is sort of where Anselm takes off from that and says, yeah, he really is a fool, and he actually believes a contradiction. If you don't believe in God, you have contradictory beliefs, therefore God has to exist. And Ganillo says, look, imagine the greatest conceivable island exists. So I'm thinking of this island, and it's perfect in every way. And he calls it the perfect island. You can think of it as the lost island. So it says, imagine there's this lost island, and it's perfect in every way. It's got sandy beaches and girls in hula skirts and whatever things that make an island perfect. You may say, but this island exists only in my mind. But I will prove that this island not only exists but has to exist. Because if the greatest conceivable island exists only in the mind, then a greater island can be imagined, which exists not only in the mind, but also in reality. So you, the island skeptic, are saying the greatest conceivable island isn't really the greatest conceivable island, which is a contradiction. Therefore, the greatest conceivable island has to exist. And you think, well, that's a ridiculous argument. And Ganillo says, I think so too. So is the ontological argument. And this argument is just like the ontological argument, except for I've replaced the word God with the word island, right? And so I could prove anything. I could prove the greatest conceivable coffee mug exists. The greatest conceivable turnip exists. The greatest conceivable pen exists, right? So an argument that can prove anything proves nothing, right? So you can't argue in this way. Ganello says you can't. Obviously, I have not proved the perfect island exists. Neither of you proved that a perfect being exists. Anselm, you screwed up someplace, and so he does this by taking the same argument form and show that something exists which obviously doesn't exist. This is just a made-up example, right? There's no perfect island. But according to this argument, it has to exist. So therefore, Anselm must have gone wrong in his argument someplace, because this is the same argument form. You should be able to plug in whatever you want, and it turns out it doesn't work. Okay, so comments or questions about Ganello's objection?
I'm not getting it.
Yeah, I'm not.
Not getting it?
Yeah.
So let's see. So
it's not like a perfect, like, are you saying that you have like a coffee cup and it's the perfect coffee cup, but some people say it's not perfect, but it's still a coffee cup?
no, it's the idea is, okay, and let's go back to like Anselm's argument. Anselm argues that the greatest conceivable being has to exist because because the greatest conceivable being wouldn't be the greatest conceivable being if he didn't exist.
So if you don't believe in him, he does exist.
No, if he didn't exist, he wouldn't be the greatest. If God didn't exist, he wouldn't be.
It's not just in your mind, not that
Yeah.
he exists or not exists as much. It's not. He doesn't exist only in your mind. That's the argument.
Yeah, if God only exists in your mind, he wouldn't be the greatest being imaginable. He wouldn't be the greatest conceivable being. Because you can think of another God which exists not just in your mind, but in reality as well. And so when you're saying God exists only in your mind, you're saying the greatest being you can imagine is the figment of your imagination, which is a contradiction. So therefore, God has to exist. That's the argument. And then so Ganello comes along and says, okay, I'm thinking about the greatest conceivable island. If you say it just exists in my imagination, I challenge you. I say, well, if it only existed in my imagination, would it really be the greatest conceivable island? Because I can think of an island which is greater, which exists not only in my imagination, but in reality as well. So I submit to you, sir, that the perfect island must exist, because otherwise it wouldn't be perfect. The greatest conceivable island must exist, otherwise it wouldn't be the greatest. Because I can imagine one that's just like the one in my imagination, but exists in reality as well. And what are you saying? You're saying the greatest conceivable the greatest conceivable island isn't really the greatest conceivable island, because you're saying the one that only exists in my mind is the greatest. But if it only exists in my mind, how can it be the greatest? Because I can think of an island which exists not only in my mind, but exists in reality as well. Therefore, the greatest conceivable island must exist. Right? So
until the next better one comes along?
Well, there is no better one. It's the greatest one imaginable. So the greatest conceivable island has to exist. And you think, wait a minute. Are you really saying this island exists? And Ganello says, no. The point is, there is no such island. You can't prove the greatest conceivable island exists by just asserting that it's a concept in your mind and then say that it wouldn't be the perfect island if it didn't exist in reality. It's a fallacious argument. And so what he's doing is he's taking Anselm's argument and taking out the word God and putting in the word island. So if you have a logical argument, it should work for anything. So if I say, what would be an example? Let me call it my starboard for a second. Let's see. Is that it? Nope. That's not it. Oh, we have to go to the applications, or it's usually down at the bottom here. Is it open? I don't think it's open. There we go. Okay, so let's see. If P, then Q. P, therefore Q. Yeah. Any, or you could say all A's are B's. X is an A. Therefore, X is a B. Like, these are like universal logical arguments. Oops, there's something going wrong here. If P then Q, P therefore Q. You can plug anything into these arguments and it's going to be a valid argument. So if you study hard, then you'll do well on the exam. You studied hard, therefore you do well on the exam. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. And you can just put whatever you want in here. All dogs are mammals. Rover is a dog, therefore Rover is a mammal. And it doesn't matter what terms you plug in here. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. So any argument, you should be able to take the argument form and plug in some new thing there, and it should work. And that's the idea of having a logical argument form. So if you give an argument, and I take out what you put in the argument, and I plug in some new terms, and the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. But if, no matter what, if I can plug in some things into the argument, like think about like an equation, if I can put stuff in the argument where the premises are all true and the conclusion turns out to be false, that shows that it's not a logical argument form. Like if I can think of something where, if I could come up with an example where all A's are B's and X is an A, but X isn't a B, that would show this argument is fallacious. If I could come up with a case where if one thing's true, then another thing's true, the first thing's true, and the second thing wasn't true, that would be a fallacious argument. So the idea is you can you think about arguments like an equation where you can plug in new terms and always know that if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true. So if you go back to Anselm, let's see, Ganillo.
It's called a syllogism, right?
Yeah. So this is see this argument here. This is modus ponens. That's one of the simplest arguments. It's called the I don't know. You call this asserting the antecedent. And there's another one called denying the consequent, where you can say, if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. And again, it works for anything. You can plug in anything for P and Q, and it's going to be valid. You know, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. If it were raining, then the ground would be wet. The ground's not wet, therefore it's not raining. When you come back to this argument, it has to be that let's see. If this argument follows logically, if you assume God doesn't exist and show that leads to a contradiction, therefore God has to exist, you should be able to take the word grace concealable being out of here and put in, say, whatever you want, and it should work. And so what Ganilla's done is instead of talking about the grace concealable being, he's talking about the grace concealable island. And the argument is it should just work, just like the grace concealable being. But obviously, the conclusion is false. The grace concealable island doesn't exist. That's sort of assumed. But he says, well, you assume that my island doesn't exist, but I'll prove that it does. Okay, I'm thinking of a perfect island now. If it didn't exist in reality, it wouldn't really be perfect, would it? Therefore, it has to exist. That's a fallacious argument. Because again, you can prove anything with this argument, right? So the idea is if you can prove anything with an argument, it's not really a good argument. Because you can prove all kinds of fantastic things that aren't really true. You know, the island doesn't exist. If the argument proves the island has to exist and the island doesn't exist, that's a problem, right? So the same thing with Anselm's argument, that it proves that God has to exist but doesn't really prove it. It doesn't prove anything because it's fallacious. Because that same argument form can be used to prove things we know aren't true. Questions or comments about that? Does it make more sense? Is it still confused? Anselm's arguing that the grace concealed being has to exist. Ganilla's saying the grace concealed being doesn't have to exist. And if you take Anselm's same way of arguing and just plug in other terms in there for God, you'll see that the argument doesn't work. So, that's his argument. It's a kind of you think about it as being a reductio argument against Anselm's reductio. So Anselm says atheism leads to a contradiction, therefore theism has to be true. And Ganilla says, look, you're not really showing atheism leads to a contradiction. There's something wrong with the argument. Now, Anselm actually has a comeback to this. And what Anselm says is the following. He says, look, my argument isn't talking about the grace conceivable kind or type of being, but the grace conceivable being, period. The greatest conceivable existing thing. Now, it doesn't work for Grace Island because anytime you pick out a category of things, there's going to be some limitation built into the concept. So think about like the island. Okay, is it really the perfect island? What would be the ultimate island? Well, an island is kind of like, what is it? It's like a bunch of sand, like on top of some rocks or something, out in the middle of the ocean. And so you think, well, an island, it's like made of material substance. It's made of sand. What if it was like a spiritual island? Wouldn't that make it better? And like islands have a beginning in time, and then maybe they get swallowed up by the ocean and they pass away. So maybe my perfect island has to be eternal. Does my island know what my needs are, and can it predict the future and give them to me? Does it know the desires of my heart? Does an island love me? Okay, well, let's add those things in there too. So, okay, so this island is a spiritual in nature, it's eternal, and what can the island do? It just kind of sits there, right? Maybe I want to give some powers to my island to make it more perfect. Well, let's say it's, the island can do anything, right? That sounds good. So the island is so I have an omniscient island who's eternal, spiritual, created me, loves me, can tell the future. It starts to look like God, right? So
like the plots of Lost.
Yeah, there you go. So once you start take out like the parts of the concept that seem to make it limiting, like made out of sand, it's material substance, it's has a finite existence. You take out the imperfect particulars, it starts looking a lot less like an island and more like God. And so the perfect island, you know, it is only going to be so perfect. It's still going to have flaws as an existing thing because it's an island. And islands, by their very nature, are limited. God is different, though. God's the greatest being imaginable. And so what you need to do is not think in terms of greatest conceivable type of being, but the argument is for the greatest existing thing, period. So you think about all the things that exist, like a rock, an island, the planet Jupiter, you know, the galaxies, and you think, what's the greatest being imaginable? Well, it's God, right? So God's going to be greater than any physical being. He's going to be the greatest being imaginable. And so the island is just one of many existing things, which isn't as good as God. And that's why the argument doesn't work. It's not parallel, because Anselm's not saying for every type of thing there's the greatest instance of it. He's saying there has to be a greatest conceivable being, period, or a greatest conceivable existing thing, is his argument. So he'll say Ganel's objection doesn't really work because it's not really fair to his argument. It doesn't represent his argument accurately. His argument isn't that every greatest conceivable type of thing must exist. It's that there's one greatest conceivable being, and that being must exist. Let me stop there for a second. Comments, questions, disputations. We're kind of go back and forth, pro and con, argument, counter argument.
Well, just because you have a description for something doesn't really mean that anything actually fits that description, right?
Mm-hmm.
So just because you have an idea of something amazing and powerful as God doesn't mean there really is anything that exists that fits that description.
Yeah, it's just a concept. And this is an a priori concept. The idea is, if you think about God enough, you'll see that he has to exist. Like Descartes puts it this way. He says, look, you can't think about a triangle without thinking in three sides. You can't think about a mountain without a valley. And so you think about the concept of a perfect being, you can't imagine a perfect being without that perfect being existing. It's locked in as part of the concept. So you think about the concept of a perfect being, and that's the concept of God, you'll see that really he has to exist. Otherwise, he wouldn't be perfect. And that is your concept of God, is of this perfect being. And so it's different than any other concept. It's kind of a special concept because you're thinking of an absolutely perfect being. An absolutely perfect being would have to exist. It's sort of like, you know, you might argue, like somebody like Hume would argue that you can't really know things a priori. Like he would say, if you're going to prove some matter of fact about what exists, you have to use your senses. But it seems like you could know certain things don't exist. Like if you know a thing can't have contrary properties. So if I told you I had like a spherical cube in my pocket, and I bet you like $50 that it was true, it'd be a good idea to take me up on it, because an object can't be spherical and cubical at the same time. Or if I said it's red all over and it's blue all over, right? Or something like that, right? So concepts limit what can be true. And so people like Anselm and Descartes will say concepts can also tell you what has to be true. That there's certain things that have to be true.
If you believe in it.
What's that?
If you believe in it.
Nothing has to be true if you believe in it. Belief has no effect on what's true.
It's just like they were saying, it's like if you suppose, or the first argument, the annotation one or whatever, it's like if you think of it enough, you'll believe into it. So,
Well, I think the idea is if you think about it, you'll figure it out. It's not the idea that you're kind of going to gin up some belief, like enthusiasm for it. Although you might say that that's what's going on. You get some monk that has too much time in his hands and it's mulled over things in his mind, and eventually, I mean, people make the same argument about like meditation and things like that. That pretty soon you make your mind go blank long enough, and you start seeing things. Especially if you're depriving yourself of food and water, and you're out in the desert and heat stroke, and start seeing visions. But I think that's kind of like an ad hominem argument. The idea is if you think deeply about the concept of God, you'll see, logically, that God can't possibly not exist. That's the argument. It's not that your belief causes God to exist. Again, I think Anselm and Descartes and Guénel would all agree that believing something doesn't make it true. Just because I believe something that has no effect on reality. But when I'm trying to figure out whether God exists or not, I should think about, well, what do I mean by God? Well, who is God? Well, God's like this sort of idea of greatest being imaginable. Okay, does such a being exist? Well, I could go out and look for evidence, but what I think about God, what kind of being is God? Well, he's this sort of perfect being. Okay, is it even possible for God not to exist? Well, if he didn't exist, he wouldn't be perfect. And then the idea is that that's like a proof for God's existence. You just think about the concept of God, and you'll see that God has to exist. That's the argument. And then Guénel's objection, and then Anselm's rejoinder here. What's gone wrong here? Well, Kant has, I think, a refutation of this, which kind of gets at what might be going on here. He says existence isn't a property, and Kant likes using linguistic terms, so he says it's not a real predicate. So you think about grammar and subject and predicate, and you treat God exists in the same way as, say, God appeared to Abraham, or God sent a tornado to Disney World because of Gay Day or whatever, right? As Pat Robertson suggested. Or God loves a cheerful giver, right? Those are real predicates. And you might differ on whether you think those sentences are true or false. But those are real predicates. But if you have the predicate God exists, is that the same as God is omnipotent or God is omniscient? And Kant says no. If you think about like the concept of like $100, the concept of a real $100 is the same concept as an imaginary $100. Conceptually, there's no difference. It's just a concept of $100. Now, if the $100 exists, that concept is instantiated in the real world. There's an instance of it. Like if I pull out like a crisp, bill with a picture of Benjamin Franklin, I think, on there. Yeah. So, and then that would be like an instance of $100. Now, if it's an imaginary $100, it's the same concept. There's no concept of an imaginary $100 and a concept of a real $100. They're the same. The same concept. It's just that if the $100 actually exists, then there's an instance of the concept, and if it doesn't, then it's not. So there might be an instance of there might be an instance of the concept of $100 in my pocket or not, right? But there's no difference in the concept. It's not like there's a real $100 and an imaginary $100. Those aren't two distinct concepts. They're the same concept. It's just the concept of $100, and then the $100 exists or it doesn't. And so existence applies to a thing and its properties together. It's not itself a property. So like I give the example in the text of like I'm selling you my car, right? And it's 20 years old, kind of beat up, but it runs good, kind of ugly, yellow, or I can't remember the description I gave of my old car. And suppose you're thinking, well, maybe I'm thinking about it, how much you want for it, and I say, $500, and you're like, okay, well, if it runs good and it's kind of ugly, I don't really care about that, but if it runs well, and $500 is a great price for a car that runs well, and I tell you, the best thing about this car, it exists, right? You think, oh, wait a minute, you're gonna sell me a non-existent car? Well, hey, it runs good, but that's not a real car. So there's no, existence isn't like a feature that you list on a car, like, manual transmission, good tires, exists. You don't put that as a description of an object. Exists applies to the whole car, right? All of the car and all of its properties together either exists or it doesn't. It's not a property you use to describe the car. Describe the car to me. Oh, well, it's kind of old, and and I wouldn't put exists there because you're assuming it exists, because I'm not going to sell you a non-existent car. So so existence applies to a thing, its properties together. So the problem that Anselm has is he's treating existence like it's a property, like being brown or square, 20 years old, or having a manual transmission, when existence isn't a property. It applies to a thing and its properties, or not. So existence isn't a real property or real predicate. There's another argument. Norman Malcolm has what's called the modal version. So this is about like possible worlds. And the idea is that God is a necessary being. This starts out this kind of as his starting point. If you think about, if there is a God, he's not the sort of being that might exist and might not exist. God exists in all possible worlds. And so that is, if there is a God, he exists in all possible worlds. And so the argument is, if God's existence is possible, then it has to be actual. Because if God is not the kind of being that exists in all possible worlds, then he's not really, it seems like he's not really God. You can imagine, if you can think about, he's not really sort of this ultimate being. If he might exist, might not exist. God seems like the sort of being that has to exist. But if you admit that God has to exist, or he's the sort of being that conceptually that would have to exist if he does exist, then if you even admit that God's existence is possible, it has to be actual. And so if you posit God as a necessary being, or a being who exists in all possible worlds, then God has to exist in this world. So that's the kind of the argument. And again, is it very intuitive? No. Is it very persuasive? Well, some people are persuaded by it. And then the objection you can make is, well, maybe God's existence isn't even possible. It seems like it is, but really it isn't. So you could say maybe there's some conceptual problem in the concept of God. Or that's kind of redundant. Then maybe there's an error in the concept of God. So you think about, like, if God's supposed to be an omnipotent being, could God create a rock so heavy you couldn't lift it? What do you think? Could God create a rock so heavy you couldn't lift it? What if you say yes? God can do anything, right? So can he do that?
Are we saying theoretically, or are we saying in our opinion?
Okay. Anything you assert is going to be your opinion unless you're being disingenuous or something, or playing devil's advocate. So we're talking about in actuality. Could God create a rock so heavy you couldn't lift it?
If he's so almighty, then yeah.
Okay, but then if he creates the rock and he can't lift it, it seems like he's not omnipotent anymore, right?
Yeah.
Well, if we can't lift it, then yeah, but if it's like...
No, could God create a rock so heavy that he couldn't lift it?
Oh.
That's a question, yeah, sorry.
Oh.
Could God create a rock so heavy that he could not lift it?
No, he's perfect.
No.
He can do whatever he wants.
But then there's something he can't do, right? Create the rock. So either God can't create a rock so heavy you can't lift it, in which case there's something God can't do. Or if he can create the rock so heavy you can't lift it, then there's something he can't do, namely lift that rock. So it seems like either way, the concept of omnipotence is incoherent. Because either way you look at it, there's something that God can't do. So that's like one of the arguments against, the concept of omnipotence is incoherent. Or you might argue that God's existence is incompatible with free will. As we talked about last time, that might be a problem with the concept of God. Or how about this of, is God's existence compatible with evil? Might be another question. The question about like God, if God has free will, then could God do evil, right? Well, if God can do evil, then he's not really good, but God's supposed to be good, but then he doesn't have free will. If God has free will, then he could do evil, then it seems like he's not morally perfect, if it's possible for him to do evil. So that may be a problem. The different ways people try to poke holes on the sort of the concept of God and show God's existence isn't even possible. And then some other objections to Anselm. You might say, well, you can say God doesn't really exist in the mind. And one thing you can do is say God doesn't exist in the mind. There are these hidden contradictions in the concept of God, and it might seem like God's existence is possible, but really it's not. That God's supposed to be omnipresent or immaterial, and maybe there's some problems with that God exists everywhere at once. Maybe that doesn't make any sense. That maybe the concept of omnipotence doesn't make any sense. That God is all powerful. Maybe omniscience doesn't fit in with free will, and we think we have free will. So you might show that there's something like the concept of God is sort of like round square, that there is a hidden contradiction in it someplace. Or you could just point out that this is sort of Kant's view that when you say God exists only in the mind, it kind of exists in kind of a fake, like not the same as really exists, right? When you say Sherlock Holmes exists as a fictional character, well, he exists in a certain sense, and a bunch of stories and movies and TV shows about it. But there isn't really a Sherlock Holmes. But you can still say, Sherlock Holmes lives at 221 Baker Street with Dr. Watson, right? Or Sherlock Holmes plays a violin, or is addicted to cocaine, or whatever. All the attributes of Sherlock Holmes, or he's really, really smart, that he's British. So those are all attributes of Sherlock Holmes, even though he doesn't exist in reality. But when you say Sherlock Holmes exists as a fictional character, it's sort of like saying God exists in the mind. Existing in the mind isn't the same as existing in reality. Existing in the mind means it's just a concept. It's a funny way of talking about being a concept. To say that Sherlock Holmes exists as a fictional character doesn't really mean that Sherlock Holmes exists. It means Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist. He's only a fictional character. People tell stories about him, but there's no real Sherlock Holmes. And the Anselm's argument seems to equivocate on this term exists when it uses exist in the mind versus exist in reality. It's using existence to mean something different in those different lines in the argument. And what is greater, being greater than which none can be deceived mean is what is the, I think about greater, is the planet Jupiter greater than, think of something, the Higgs boson, or the super collider. Say the super collider and the moon. Which is greater? Oh, I know the super collider can do more stuff and it advances the frontiers of knowledge. The moon is a lot bigger, but the moon is just like a big dumb rock. What does greater mean?
Without the moon, we wouldn't exist, thus Hadron Collider wouldn't.
I suppose without, the moon essential for life on planet Earth.
It has a
It
gravitational
moves the
pull
tides
that
and stuff.
helps
Yeah.
with the tides and stuff it is.
I'm not sure that's true. I mean, what would happen if the moon left its orbit? It would probably cause catastrophic damage to the planet. Well, I'm not sure that the moon being there is necessary for life on
Well,
Earth.
in the past, for the creation of life to happen.
I don't know if I agree. But maybe I don't know enough about ancient.
It might not be necessary for life
Geography.
to exist, but it is necessary for us to exist here. I mean, because our planet wouldn't be able to survive if we didn't have the moon keeping us here.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
I mean, and.
Well, I guess we're delving into astronomy here. But you think about the term greater than, what does it mean? You know, it was the Black Plague greater than Napoleon's army. You know, what are these terms greater than or perfect? They seem like really abstract and vague. And
I would say the plague was greater.
what's that? The plague was greater.
Yeah.
'Cause it killed
Because it's
more
a
people.
smaller thing that took out more people than Napoleon's army.
But then, like, what does greater mean, and what does greater mean?
I would say greater means something small that can do big things.
Or how about like the printing press? Or think about like the plague versus, I don't know, deep blue, right? Or something like that, some like artificial intelligence, yeah.
Well, just going with non-standard objections, don't people have a very different idea of what perfection is? Why couldn't we say that can be seen by everybody, could be a perfection, or it would be knowable by
Yeah.
all beings? Like, why can't we see it then? You know?
Yeah, I mean, that might be a big flaw that God's like sort of hiding from us or something.
The other thing is God created man, and why do man have so many flaws?
Yeah, and that's what we'll get to that when we talk about the problem of evil, because that seems to be an inconsistency in that God is this perfect being, but he created this flawed universe. But it just seems like these terms, greater and greatest, they're all sort of based on Platonic metaphysics and this idea of this chain of being, where you have kind of the shadows and the images of things, and then you get sort of concrete objects, and then you sort of go up the chain to more sort of celestial objects in the spiritual world. And it's all based on this kind of abstraction, based on Plato's theory of forms, and not really based in reality. Yeah?
It seems like perfection is unattainable. We're always striving for improvement. It's like, so perfection, it's just like you said, it's vague and it's hard to actually describe when it's non-existent.
Yeah, perfection itself seems to be an abstraction, sure.
When we do think it exists, but yeah, it's, I don't know.
I think perfection is where it just can't be, anything else can't be added to it to make it great.
Mhm.
Greater.
And it does make, kind of intuitive sense that I think people think about the concept of God as a sort of ultimate being that doesn't have any flaws.
That's literally the only thing that you can think of that would be perfect.
Mhm.
It's like there's not really anything, that's here in this world physically that could be perfect. It's like there's always something more. So using that terminology, perfect being, that's like one of the things that can actually describe something as being perfect.
Well, what about like a perfect circle?
It's an idea.
Like, can I draw a perfect circle?
Well, it depends on what the definition of a perfect circle is.
Well, like you might say, like a perfect circle is one where all the points are equidistant from the center.
Right. A 360 line drawn around a circle.
That's kind of a sucky circle. I have these shapes here, like in my shape.
Yeah, that would make a perfect circle.
That's not the right ones. Can I do that? I don't know. Where are these auto shapes things? I don't usually use these.
Bottom.
At the bottom.
Bottom left.
Oh, here we go. Right, so here's. No, why isn't it?
You have to pick it.
Oh, there we go. Where's the circle? There. There. That is a perfect circle. So then I compare these two things here, and I'm like, okay, oops, there's some perfect, and there's an imperfect circle, and I sort of have this concept, but it's given like what's the concept of a set of points equidistant from a central point. But then, like the points, themselves, it has to have each of these lines have some thickness. And if we looked at this with like a microscope, we'd see like there's slight variations of the pixels maybe.
And then it's like, how do you know which is perfect? Like the size or like the pixels that make up it? Like, it's like a different size of circle could be more perfect to somebody else than it could be you.
And it's only perfect in a certain regard, like it's
Right.
symmetry or something like that, right?
Yeah, it's like the general term. It's like a perfect circle. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, it looks perfect, like you said. It's like the distance around it from the center point. So.
It's a circle as, a geometric figure or something like that.
Right.
But maybe perfect, like often it has to do with like human desires and purposes. Like, so maybe this would be like, that would be the perfect circle for my, poster that I'm gonna post on campus or something.
Yeah.
Maybe I want something that looks more hand-drawn. So all of these terms seem kind of vague. So ontological argument, it's kind of,
Seems vague.
I tend to think about it as being sort of an intellectual curiosity, but it comes up every once in a while. I had a friend when I was an undergrad who was convinced that it was very profound and proved God's existence. It was the best argument going there. But she was kind of an outlier. I think that most people are, even people that believe in God aren't convinced that this is a good argument for God's existence, because it seems to rest on some equivocation in terms of existence and confusion between concepts and objective reality and has lots of problems with it. So even the modal version seems to have some problems with it. So even though at University of Notre Dame they keep on resurrecting it every few years and publishing papers in the academic journals about yet another proof that the ontological argument is sound, probably not. Don't hold your breath for some definitive proof that actually it is sound. Although, now, Bertrand Russell was convinced for 2 weeks. He writes his biography that one time he was coming out of class and he had a tin of tobacco and he threw it up in the air and said, "By Jove, the ontological argument is sound." And he believed in God for like 2 weeks, and then he realized that he's fallacious and went back to being an atheist. So there you go for the ontological argument. So moving on to the cosmological argument, more intuitive, perhaps more persuasive on Tuesday. Don't forget to take the exam by Tuesday also, and I'll see you then.